Okay.
All right, done.
All right. So this is the September 21 SIG network subproject for network policy API meeting. And just to quickly summarize, we are going to talk about starting KEPs to propose as enhancements in in the Kubernetes SIG network repo. We went through the change for the API for port ranges, and I think an action item is on Ricardo that he will go ahead and open an issue, and then we can follow up as a KEP. We'll probably look at something similar to this as a proposal, and Andrew suggested that we use a proper struct for port ranges, but we can discuss these changes over the related issue, and then we can we also now we are discussing the namespace as a name, which is being actively discussed on the Google Groups mailing thread raised by Tim Hawken. So yeah, Ricardo, you had some comments about that.
Yeah. So just to finish about that, so this is a discussion that's ongoing between Tim Hawken, Dan Winship, and Clayton Coleman, and a lot of other folks from SIG Architecture. And I've sent the link in the chat if you can open that chat. So just I think that would be important for the folks in this sub-project to follow this one and also put your thoughts in that. So we used to have a no-go about that because labels was a primitive in the selector. And this is being rethinked because of you need airbag or you don't need airbag for labels, and you can like force a label in your namespace and forge, like have a rogue namespace. So this is probably going to be a goal, and I think this is also a good one to propose in the SIG network mailing list, so we can open the issue and say, oh, we are seeing this discussion ongoing, so we think that we can move forward with this one. Anyone have a no-go for this? Otherwise, we're going to open the issue and write a cap.
Yeah, I thought that, yeah, if anything, I agree with you. Like this mailing thread that Tim started is, if anything, it's kind of validation for that use case, because it kind of highlights what are the limitations today using label selectors for namespaces. So yeah, +1. If anything though, like it highlights the fact that when we do propose selecting namespaces by like a list of names, we should be very clear around how that intersects with selectors, right? Like, can you define both, or should the API reject if you try to do both, and should it only allow one or the other? Things like that. So +1.
Yeah, so I also +1 to the user story, and this is a good validation. The only thing that I think I offline mentioned this to Andrew was that this is clearly a problem about the network policy APIs. It's not just the network policy API that needs to tackle this particular use case, but I think, and I know Jay was also on board with this, is that maybe with the proposal of the cluster scope network policy, we try to solve this problem and we propose a solution, and then we can show that this is working. This is how we worked out the problem with the cluster network policy, and now let's see whether we can solve this problem on a larger scale with cooperation with different SIGs. So that would be my proposal on this, or my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we wouldn't necessarily want to add this, like we wouldn't want to add an API for selecting against names if the validating webhook configuration ended up doing it differently, right? Like we want them to semantically look the same. So that is a good point on like waiting to see what the community comes up with and then just converging on that. Yeah, but I don't know, but I feel like it's such a like if we were to implement in the API, it'd just be like a list of names, right? Like, is it more complicated than that?
That's true. I think, but the only thing is, like, I think you brought up that point a few minutes earlier, is the how do we validate these things? Like, how does it interact with label selectors? What would be the outcome if both have been specified, if there are conflicting things, or is it like a union? So those kind of things, like the semantics behind the label selector and this kind of a name selector.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So as part of like our network policy API plus proposal, maybe if we can have like that hashed out, and then bring this to, you know, broader table, maybe one of the days in the SIG network community meetings, we can propose this and see if, you know, folks agree there, and then take it up with the guys on admission controller side and see whether we have a proposal that converges and solves the use cases of all the communities or the SIGs. Then maybe that could be the next step. But I guess the first step would be to come up with a proposal.
Yeah, I agree. So, Ricardo, you mentioned that you were going to create an issue before the proposal, or what did you say you were going to do for next steps?
No, I'm thinking about sending this to the mailing list first, because enhancement process has changed, and you need to have some discussion before opening the issue. So
Okay.
so I'm going just to probably post this one and say, hey, like I'm going to probably spam our mailing list and say we have for each of the user stories. I don't know if for each of the user stories, or maybe consolidate all of them in one, so we can have like a mailing list thread to post in the issue of the enhancements repo before opening everything. What do you think that's better? Like everything in one email, or?
You're asking, so you're asking if we should have a thread per use case, or just all the use cases in one email? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. Because we need a thread before opening the issue. They ask for this right now.
Yeah. So I think personally, I'd be in favor of starting a single conversation around just the four V1 use cases, and also maybe like on the same day there's a SIG meeting, we can also raise it in the SIG meeting. But I think ideally I think we should present it with like a really like short, concise Google Doc with those four use cases. I think that issue 30 is lacking in a little bit of details. So maybe like, and also like I don't want to be that person, but do we have consensus on those four? Because I feel like I agree with those. I know, Ricardo, you do. But are we as a sub-project happy about those four things to propose as like the next thing we want to add to V1?
I'm +1 for all of them, for all the four. I don't know anybody have something against them. I think that's a better question.
Yeah, I'm +1 for these four. The only thing is that the cluster network policy would need a lot more thought process to go into it. But yeah, even the nodes, I think, but in general, I am also +1 for these. Like, I'm not against any one of them individually.
Yeah, but I definitely think there needs to be some document that talks about each use case with a bit more detail, but not too much detail where, you know, it's going into implementation. And that's probably the thing that we want to share with the SIG before we start with KEPs. I don't know.
Okay, so
Ricardo, what were you planning on sharing?
Instead of sending to the mailing list, proposing them in the next SIG meeting. That's better, right?
No, I meant both. So like once we have a short doc that highlights those four use cases, send it to the mailing list, and then queue it up in the SIG meeting. so both, I think. But I think ideally though, I'd really like us to get to a place where we have the 4 use cases written in a Google Doc, and the majority of us have commented like a +1 or like, yeah, I agree with this, just so that it looks like we're presenting the use cases. Well, not looks like we have discussed these quite a bit. But yeah, just showing that we've discussed the use cases in quite a lot of detail before we present it.
So Andrew, so here in this particular proposal doc folder, this is more like an abstract thing. It's not really going into any implementation. It kind of goes into the two, like an administrator focus and a developer focused policies. And then within that, I was intending to add, for the cluster scope, this kind of maps to the issue that we have for the cluster network policy, which is which we all agree on. And in the dev scope, what I was planning to do was to add two details, two sort of proposals. One is the additive ones, which kind of includes the 3 use cases that are part of the 4 use cases, which is the namespace as a name, the nodes, and node selectors. And the third one was the port ranges. And the alternative was going to be a new API. So do you think we can use these documents to hash out those four accepted use cases and propose that and maybe work on these?
So maybe I misunderstood. So my thinking is that a lot of that is what would end up going into the CAP. But what Ricardo is saying is that we need to kick off a discussion and kind of just entertain the idea of those use cases to the SIG before we can propose the CAP. So I was thinking like something really brief and short that highlights what it is, but without going into too much.
I was thinking in the doc about like having a well structured for each of the user stories. What is it? What are our objectives with that? Like what we are trying to achieve or what we are trying to solve. Something of the discussion, but really briefly, like what you said about the namespace with name selector abstract, and then like something with 5 lines maximum per user story, so anyone can read. Oh, nice! You are trying to solve this one. There is the discussion in the comments. I think that's better, and propose that.
Okay, so here's one question. Which I just was looking over. And so the node selector, does it make sense for it to be part of a developer API, or should it be an administrator API or part of the cluster network policy?
That's a great question. I think that the node selector is mostly related to node part, maybe. I'm trying just to recover in my memory.
Because from what I remember, the user story was more about allowing pods or services to be able to talk to the interfaces, the nodes interfaces. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anyone who remembers the user story?
Yeah, I think so.
So if we want to allow access of pods to the node or the host, then we need to ask ourselves that whether is this an admin API, or is this a developer, or is this something that is relevant to both?
What's the context for? I mean, I get why we have to like categorize it, but what's the reason for defining
the reason the reason to bring this up is then we have a cluster network policy, which then is this just to talk about that we need a new API, or is this about like a detailed sketch of the policy? If this is just about to talk about a new API, then I guess having these 4 as separate items is fine.
Yeah, I think the cluster network policy one was to introduce a new resource in the existing API group, right?
Got it. So if we are not delving deep into like what it will be responsible for, or what the sketch of that API will look like, then I guess the 4, then I think it makes sense to have these 4 top level ones.
Yeah, I think what we're aiming for, or what Ricardo is proposing, is that we'd have a short doc with like 5 sentences at most describing like what the use case or the user story we're trying to solve for, and then once that kind of once we share that with the SIG and we start writing the KEP, then in the KEP we can then start diving into like the personas and what the API would look like. And that probably deserves either like a KEP per each, or we could have like one big KEP with all of them. I don't know.
Yeah, and plus one KEP per each, so we can have like different discussions. Otherwise, it's going to be like 100 or more comments trying to solve one thing and not other, so it's easier.
Correct. And thanks for clarifying. I mean, I think I just wanted a clarification, so I agree.
Okay, so this is in my backlog list. I'm probably going to start writing this and send to you in Slack or somewhere else, just to take a look into that. And this is what and our deadline is probably next Wednesday, so we can send to the SIG mailing list and also show in the next meeting. Sounds good? That's okay.
When's the KEP deadline again, you said?
Not this one, the next one.
Okay. Would it be reasonable for you to have that doc done by the next meeting Monday, and then we can, as a group, like sign off on it, and then you can share it?
Yeah, sure. Probably going to do this on weekend, but yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Do you need help writing that?
I don't think so right now. I'm going to start to the schema, but then later I'm probably going to ping you all in Slack. I just need to start because I'm pretty not organized, so I'm going to glue a post-it here and look at it every day and remember that I need to write that. So.
Okay, yeah, you can ping us to see if you need any help on any of that.
Great, thank you all. Thank you. So this is right here, yeah. So about those use cases, so we have the Node Selector, that's the point that Abhishek has put, and also about the cluster network policy. So we have a +1 for the port ranges, a +1 for the namespace as a name. The node we need to discuss better, put in the document. What about the cluster network policy? What do you think about that? I'm +1 for this one because of my use days, but I think that also we have the problem of this being mostly a cluster admin related than a developer related. So I don't think this is going to stick into the original proposal of the viewer network policy, but also this can be proposed as a CRD later. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. This is, the other three, we can reason about for V1, but this is a separate API, so a completely new resource.
This is a completely new object, right?
Yeah.
It's not a network policy. This is like a V1, sorry, that's a V1 beta 1 / cluster network policy.
Correct.
Sorry, I want to clarify. So I think what Abhishek is saying is that it's the same API group, but a new resource or kind in the existing. Okay.
I think also this is a new kind of API. Probably it can have like a reference. I don't know if this is going to work, but like a reference for some existing network policy, like an object reference. But I also think this is a new kind. This needs some discussion.
Yeah. So, maybe because if we have no other topics for the agenda, I'd love to just banter about this topic. So like in my mind, cluster network policy would basically be, we fork network policy in the existing API group, and on the high level spec we add either namespace by name or namespace selector, so that you can select pods across multiple namespaces, and then like each to and from selector in the rules are also, well, they would still have namespace selectors, but basically it's like just the addition of selecting namespaces at the top in addition to pod selectors. And I know we're going into implementation details, but if we have extra time,
I think we can dig deeper into this one, Andrew. I'm okay with that. Maybe because the other ones they seems pretty easy, because that's only an additional field. Only, sorry, it's not easy at all, but that's a newer field. And this one, I think that we should dig a little deeper. Yes. And this is also something that everybody asks, and we are always in a loop, like, oh, it would be great if I have a cluster network policy that allows me to go to any, like, to DNS without having to put this rule in every single namespace. So
yeah, so yeah, Gobin, Yang, and I, we were thinking about the same, and kind of came up with some of these responsibilities for a cluster scope policy. I think an administrator would be more responsible for all the pods in a cluster as opposed to individual services, or at least like a big group of services rather than a smaller subset of services. And then namespaces, nodes, and any interaction of traffic from within the cluster to outside of the cluster. There was also another thing that came up, is like, how do we determine the precedence of evaluation or enforcement of these policies? The cluster admins policy should supersede all developer written policies. But in addition to that, there might also be a need to outline the cluster defaults. What happens if there is no policy match? Then should it be allowed or should it be disallowed? And I think in the end, I think you also added something like auditing whether how the logging policy for the cluster or individual policy. So these are the things that we kind of like came up with. So I don't know whether this answers, Andrew, some of your questions, or like, is it something that you were looking for?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so precedence. Sorry, I'm just reading what's there. So are we saying that cluster network policy does take precedent over any namespace scope policy?
So this is not a answer. This is more of a question to, what are the things that an administrative focused policies or a cluster network policy would need to think about. Now, one of the things is that, if you have, these are some of the use cases that come often, that you want to solve, or you have like a security policy for your company that you cannot expose certain ports. So those are the kind of policies which need to take precedence over the developer written policies. Like, even if a developer writes a policy saying that allow my port 53 to be accessed from anywhere, but if an administrator does not want that to happen, then that should be enforced before the developer policy. On the other hand, if there is, a developer can write some policies to expose their services outside of their namespaces or cluster, and if that doesn't happen, then the administrator may have like certain default or a fail-safe set of rules that the cluster needs to adhere to, and those would then be enforced after the developer policies. So those are the kind of questions, like, how do we, first of all, whether this makes sense, and second, if yes, then how do we solve that? And this doesn't, this document doesn't answer that question, but it's just that, these are the things that maybe we need to think about.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is there ever a case where we would want the cluster scope network policy to override only deny rules, but allow rules should be it should be allowed. You should be allowed to overwrite the allow rules. Or sorry, maybe it's the other way around. But like, is there a use case where like we only want either allow or deny to be to take precedent at the cluster scope level, but then on the namespace scope level, whatever you define there overrides what the cluster scope network policy defines. Am I making sense?
So yeah, I don't see Gobind on the call, but this was his comment from last week, was that in his opinion, a cluster administrator is more focused towards tightening the security of his cluster. Like he will be more interested in denying things than opening things up. While the developer would be more responsible for allowing things or opening up access to his services. So I think that's the view that he came from, like the so there's like deny more, like a cluster network policy would be more useful for denying as a deny action, while the Kubernetes network policies, which act as the developer policies, are more about like allowing specific access. So I don't have an answer to that, to your question, but this was one of his comments which was kind of related.
But we can think like, I want, as a cluster admin, I want all the namespaces to have a default egress deny, and being the responsibility of the user to open anything that he wants, but to specific locations. So having a restricted namespace and being the user responsibility to open the network policies. So I think this is one case of precedence.
Yeah, the other one I was thinking, which is the reverse, and which is what I think Gobind was mentioning, is if I have a rule that allows all traffic to like let's say like kubedns or GoreDNS, whatever, but then the developer or like the namespace scope policy says to actually deny traffic to DNS. We shouldn't. It seems like we should always deny. Like if there's a chain of rules and one of them's denied, that should be respected at any level. Whereas the opposite with deny rules wouldn't apply. Which is, I'm basically just repeating what Gobind said, but
yeah, so that's true. So so that is the thing that fail safe, like maybe your core DNS traffic was something as a fail safe rule that the cluster admin has put in, but the developer will have control over adding more restriction on those. So I think it's a clear pattern that we see that there will be certain rules which have to be executed or enforced before the developers policies, but there will also be a certain set of rules which will be enforced after the developer policies. So we need to be able to handle, or the API needs to be able to handle these kind of requests.
yeah, that'll be tricky. But we'll get to it.
You have two categories of rules. Like you have one that's the defaults, and you have one that's the strict rules. Like this you cannot override. This is the default, but you can override. Do you know what I mean? Because like you may have a rule that denies everything, every egress traffic, but allows you to create anything. But you can also have a rule that strictly forbids you to access like the metadata from AWS and allows you to like curl into the metadata and get some user key, and you don't want your pods to do that. So I think those are two cases.
So
yeah,
how about like, I don't know whether this will solve all of this, but how about like instead of like an ingress and egress as like top level spec fields, how about something like a whitelist and a blacklist, where the blacklist is something which has higher precedence, because this is where the admin wants to deny for sure and needs to be enforced before any of the developer policies are executed. And then there is a whitelist, which is kind of like a lower precedence than the developer policies, whereas the admin is kind of like allowing certain traffic, but as a developer you can deny or restrict that. Maybe this is something that we can think of in this direction. Or there could be the other way, which, I think Ricardo was kind of going towards this, like some rules, and then you have like another section for defaults.
Yeah, I think it would be a hard sell to move away from ingress egress in V1, but definitely for V2, that I think we should talk about that.
But
because like it wouldn't make.
But this is not V1 or V2, right? This is a new API, so it is a brand new sketch, so it should not affect the existing.
Right, but if we're saying it's a brand new resource in the same API group, you like ideally they should have similar looking, at least in my mind. Like in my mind, like it'd be weird if I was like creating network policy APIs, and then when I switch to cluster network policy APIs, it's like a completely different semantic around like allow and deny lists. Like I would expect them to be similar, but one is just like expanded to all namespaces while the other is one.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think, yeah, but I think at least everyone agrees that this is a problem that we need to.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. If we have 5 more minutes and there's no one else wants to talk about anything else, I'd love to also talk about the node selector one. Particularly, I think what's going to be tricky there is how to determine what the node IPs are, because today, like the node object has some information and status around what are its addresses. So it has like the internal IP, external IP fields, right? Or types. Should an implementation of network policy decide which address type to use, or should the address type information be exposed part of the network policy API to say like select these nodes with this label and only take its internal IPs?
Yeah, that's. I mean, on one hand, it's good to have these kind of like detail or like level of control. On the other hand, we should not make it more difficult for people to use the API. So it's going to be again another tricky thing to solve.
Yeah, I agree.
Because then how much control do you want to give? Because you may have certain nodes wherein you want to allow the internal IPs, and certain other set of nodes where you want to allow some other interfaces. It can get messier. I don't know if others have any other opinion on this.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think that like the cloud load balancers, they use the external IP, right? But on the other hand, we are trying to select the internal one because of the pods, but they can also try to reach the external one if this is the case. And this is going to be a mess, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I think most cloud load balancers actually use an internal IP. But it's not so the internal IP usage is not an explicit definition. Like nothing is saying select internal IPs. It just happens that like when you add a node into the cloud load balancer's backend, it registers the internal IP for that. But yeah, I agree. Like that's something that we should like basically like, do we want to expose that into network policy APIs, or should it just be like all address types by default? Or I don't know, but yeah, something to steep on as we think about the node selector one.
Yeah, I think that we can probably have a default behavior, but also allow one to select that. Then, like, okay, the default behavior is good. We are going to select the internal one because the internal is mostly the white one. Use it. You always, as far as I know, you always have the internal IP, but the external IP is up to the cloud provider, right? So
yeah, most of the time, yeah.
So I think we can propose like having this one as a default, and probably growing up later. Like, oh, I have this case of the external one. we are probably going to deal to the need to. We are probably going to need to deal with IPv6, also IP families, once this ship into the code. So I don't know if nodes already have the IP families and the IPv6, and this is going to grow up more and more. So we can start with the default one and say, okay, once we got this, we are going to evolve the fields.
So shall we come back to this node selector next week? We do a little more homework and probably also see if Zhang can join, because I think she is the author on this one. So if we can get a use case, I mean, if we can clarify the use case, I think we'll be able to be in a better position to solve this. Because we are already at time. So
yeah, definitely something that should be in the cap.
Sorry.
I was just saying it should definitely something that should be in the cap when we get there.
Yeah, I think the user story is pretty clear here. Like the pod wants to scrape all nodes for metrics, and it's going to scrape the nodes using the kubelet read only port. So this is mostly an egress, not an ingress rule, but also I think this is pretty clear.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think we're at time, so maybe we can, punt this discussion to next week. There was one more question that I had was, to Anish. I saw him uploading a user story. I don't know whether he wanted to discuss that in the meeting. If yes, then maybe we can do that next week. This was regarding the IP namespace, something regarding the IP blocks.
Yeah, I think this is what Anand had brought up initially, based on what we've seen from users requesting at Microsoft.
Okay.
And then I had a chat with Jay on Slack, and he recommended I just open a PR to upload it. So, but we can discuss this next week.
Okay, great. So maybe we'll put that on the agenda next week so we don't lose this.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So if there's nothing else, then maybe we can end the meeting.
Okay. For me, that's okay. I'm going to write the doc and send to you all. Thank you, folks. Have a nice week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much for joining.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.